Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID update. Let me share my screen. To Ukraine with love. Yeah. Now I'm talking about Ukraine today strictly in the context of the COVID crisis, the so-called. And the reason is that, the invasion of Ukraine, sadly enough, is an opportunity to end the COVID crisis. We've had several such opportunities. Of course, in March 2020, we had the choice to never start this crisis in the first place. We could have just applied reason and tailored policies, and we would not be in a crisis at all. But we didn't do that. Then in the first half of 2021, when we had the vaccines available, we could have done the right thing to distribute the vaccines to those people who are actually at risk, statistically speaking. And we know those statistics. We could have done that. And by mid-2021, we basically could have declared victory. We would have had potentially, 90% or so vaccination of all those people who really are at risk would have been achievable if we had systematically, globally pursued this approach, but we did not. So the vaccines, in the end, they may have saved some lives, but they did not end to, us ending the crisis. Then early this year, Omicron came along together with a bit of a fatigue. People are starting to get tired of the whole thing, luckily. And Omicron could have been the end game. As some people started advocating that maybe with Omicron we can get out of the crisis, but so far we didn't, right? Governments are very reluctant to get out of the crisis because, they made the crisis, and they love it, right? Because it gives them something to do, right? And it gives them tools to suppress, terrorize people, which they like to do. So governments are very reluctant to let go of this COVID crisis. But I think they were starting, in the face of Omicron and general fatigue in the population, they were starting to look for ways to move on to the next thing. And lo and behold, thanks to Mr. Putin, the next thing came along, and that's the invasion of Ukraine. So very ironically and sadly, the suffering of the Ukrainian people may go hand in hand with the relaxation of the terror that the other 8 billion people have been exposed to over the last 2 years. Why? Because governments have a new toy, and I'm sorry if I say it that way, and especially with apologies to the Ukrainians who are suffering from this invasion. But it is just a toy, right, to politicians. That, politicians, like little children, need something to play with, and now they've got a new toy. So as tough as this is for the Ukrainians, as much it may actually really relieve the rest of the world from the terror we've been under. So that in some ways there's actually one piece of good news attached to the invasion. To be very clear, completely oppose this invasion. I think it's completely silly and unjustified. And so I agree with the consensus here that is quite broad outside Russia. Except I would say, but it has a silver lining, or it has a positive aspect, which is it gets the governments worldwide to take their eyes off the COVID ball and put it on the new ball. And unfortunately for the Ukrainian people, they're that bouncing ball. Politicians need something to get their teeth into. And if you're unlucky, you're the guinea pig. Right now, the Ukrainians are the guinea pig. But at least it's not entirely in vain, because it does potentially help the rest of the world get some of our basic rights back. If you remember, in December or so, I had this hierarchy where I said, well, humanity is in a constant decline. We used to go to war against heroes and princes, and now we go against the war against the virus, which is a nanoparticle, and temperatures, which is a purely abstract physical thing. So it's we've put ourselves onto a lower and lower stage of civilization, and at least with the invasion of Ukraine, we are pulling ourselves back up a little bit on the ladder of civilization, where at least it's like a state against a state, or a state against a population, which is terrible enough, right? But at least the Ukrainian people are in this war being treated like people. In the war against the virus, we were not being treated like human beings. Right? We were just treated like animals. Right? In the war against climate change, we will be treated like, we are part like a chemical. At least in the invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people are being treated like human beings. They're being shot at, they're being bombarded, they're being mistreated, but they're being mistreated as human beings. That's why it's a higher stage of civilization. Yeah. And again, this apologies to the Ukrainians who may not want to hear this, right? I understand. Yeah, I wouldn't want to hear it either if I was Ukrainian. And I'm not saying you're better off than before, but you're not, but all the other humanity actually may be better off now, thanks to this invasion. Just to keep sort of summarizing points I've made before, but cardinal errors that we've made over the last 2 years, looking 2 years back now, right? We're at the 2-year point. We declared the spread of a common cold virus a pandemic, which is not in line with most standard definitions of pandemic, as I pointed out before. We gave this pneumonia that may sometimes arise from this infection a fancy acronym, COVID, which was totally unnecessary. It's just another pneumonia, right? But by our wording, by our conceptualization of these things and our communication and our discussion of these things, we create fear and terror, and in turn, we allow governments to use it as a pretext to then institute a state of exception, not exemption, exception, I'm sorry, there's a typo here, whereby they can suspend their constitutions, where they can suspend basic human rights on the basis of, oh, there's a pandemic, right? Even though by most definitions, there is no pandemic. So the mislabeling and the miscommunication leads to then a misappropriation of power and a abuse of power. We have been focusing on an imagined collective risk of transmission. Yes, there's a transmission, but the main risk isn't the transmission or the virus. The main risk is the immune system. Some people have a compromised immune system, especially elderly. This is an individual risk and not a collective risk. And we should have had, therefore, individually targeted approaches rather than collective and undifferentiated policies. Right? We also should have relied much more on natural immunization than on just man-made solutions. The vaccines are very good, they work, they are an additional layer of protection, but they do not replace the need for natural immunization because they don't expose us to the full virus, nor do they expose us to the multiple variants of the virus, right? So it's only a partial protection in a sense that we may well be protected for some time from getting severely ill, and that's great. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the vaccines, but it does not replace the need for constant exposure to the actual natural virus so that our immune system can build up a long-term competence to deal with it very effectively, as it does with all the other common cold viruses. We should have treated this virus just what it is, which is a common cold virus, but we didn't. We treated it as some kind of like weirdo, which it isn't. It's a very standard cold virus. We should have treated this as a global phenomenon, which is what it is, right? And not a national one. So every nation state having their own little thing, which makes no sense. And then creating those borders, which almost then create different ecosystems from the point of view of the virus, which is totally unnecessary and counterproductive. If we had had a global sort of framework and then local healthcare systems reacting that, and on information provided from the global level, such as the World Health Organization, for example, I mean quality information, that would have been the most effective mechanism. The nation state almost isn't in there, except that they may have to distribute funds or so, because those funding mechanisms are national. I mean, I respect that, but there was very little role here for politicians in this. And most of the roles they played were counterproductive and negative and dangerous. And terroristic and totalitarian. One of the key cardinal errors was the natural monopolization of truth, not natural, sort of a, sort of natural in the sense that following the established structures, truth and reason are monopolized by governments and by the official media. And very little, in many countries, very, very little debate about the actual situation. Right? And in many countries, if you actually dare to talk about COVID as it actually is, you were stamped as a crazy person, as a conspiracy theorist, or some other marginal person, in some countries even persecuted. There has been, up to this point, for 2 years, no quality discussion about immune systems, about what COVID really is, about what government policies are legal and what are not legal, what are our rights, etc. All these complexities that I've been talking about for 2 years, they have not been in the public debate. The whole thing was underpinned by an ideology of, sort of sterility, of complete detachment from nature. I mean, so you're allowed to watch a bird sing and enjoy the singing bird, but you're not allowed to expose yourself to a virus, even though the virus is just as natural as the bird. There is this sort of hygiene ideology that forces us to more and more detach ourselves from nature. And it will eventually lead us into the metaverse or somewhere where we become so disembodied that, the body is no longer really exist. That's where the logical end game is of this kind of sterility and hygiene ideology that we've been driving. Right? And that will be a form of dehumanization. We will be all mind and no body. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, but that's where this is eventually heading. If you think through it and if you extrapolate from where we are going at the moment. So what could have been, instead of misinterpretations, we could have had interpretation. Instead of a state of exception, we could have a state of normality. We could have had a normal life the last 2 years, no problem. It would have been easy to do, but governments just jumped on the opportunity to take away our basic rights. Right? And they're very reluctant now to give them back to us. We could have focused on the individual rather than the collective. We could have had targeted policies instead of undifferentiated policies. We could have put much more emphasis on natural exposure than just man-made solutions such as the vaccines, although the vaccines are a very good complement for those people who will have a significant risk. So I have many times acknowledged that the vaccines were really helpful and continue to be helpful, but only for a certain relatively limited set of people. Right? The vast majority of people don't need the vaccines, and they just need to be naturally exposed as much as possible, which is the opposite of what the governments have been trying to do. Right? Instead of national response, we could have had a combination of a global framework and then local responses. Instead of a monopoly on truth and reason, we could have had a real discussion. And instead of an ideology on sterility, of pure focus on number of bodies saved rather than on the quality of our life and our freedoms, we could have had much more wisdom about how humans are embedded in nature and what it means to be part of nature, including in our encounter with viruses. But there was no wisdom in this entire affair. And I'm afraid that going forward, we will be entering an age of discrimination. We will be slowly moving away from many of the measures, but I think there will, in many places, there will be continued discrimination against the unvaccinated. There will be a continued discrimination against border crossers. So if you're crossing a so-called national border, you're treated differently than if you're just crossing from one street to the other street, or from one block to the other block, or from one city to the other city. And thirdly, against people who consider mask wearing undignifying and dehumanizing, as I do, right? And people like me who really, really do not feel human when I wear a mask, I will continue to be discriminated against in many places, not in all places, but in many places. Governments think of masks as very effective in slowing down the virus. And A, they don't understand that slowing down the virus doesn't do anything. And B, they don't understand that people have such a thing as a dignity, because those politicians themselves, of course, don't have dignity, and so they don't know what it is. So they have no sense of someone feeling undignified when they wear a mask, because they have no dignity. They've never experienced dignity, and so they don't know what it is. So yeah, so these groups of people, and there's a lot of overlap, they may be more or less the same people, people like myself, and I'm certainly, I feel very, very affected by this. I think we will experience discrimination for many years to come. That's to me quite likely. Which means we continue to be in an affected world. We will have these discriminations, and we will also have a continued coexistence of multiple types of regimes. Iceland has declared the end to all measures. That's one extreme. China, on the other extreme, is like absolutely no end to any of the measures. So still, you know, as before, a very divergent set of policies on a national level. And there's no end in sight to this diversity and destruction, and therefore there's nothing that indicates that we are moving back to early spring or late spring, if you like, to springtime anyways. Some countries may be moving that way, but as a whole, as a globe, as a human civilization, no. We're deep into the fractured world, and we are not going to come out of that anytime soon. Okay, so last time I talked about how Omicron could lower our IFR, and I made a thought experiment that showed, oh, it could lower it to 1.18. But I said that's subject to finding some real data, whether, you know, what is actually the effect of Omicron. And I found some data from Southern California. The CDC there did some, I think it was the CDC, but anyway, so someone in Southern California did a piece of research, and they showed that compared to about 6 months earlier, when the Delta variant was rampant, now under Omicron at the beginning of this year, hospitalizations were down by 60 to 70%, and the length of stay in hospital was also down by 60 to 70%, which suggests that probably fatalities are also down by 60 to 70%. Now, as I said before, you need to be wary of comparing apples and oranges, and the people who did the study also say that. They acknowledge that 6 months prior, obviously, natural immunization rates were lower and vaccination rates were also lower, right? So some part of that lower fatality that we are, significantly lower fatality that we're experiencing now, is not due to the Omicron virus or variant. It's due to higher natural immunization and higher vaccination rate, right? So that part you need to sort of take out. So you need to normalize for that. They didn't do that in the study. They just pointed out that that is an issue, right? But they didn't try to calculate that normalization. I didn't calculate it in detail, but since I'm tracking both the IR and the VR, the infection ratio and the vaccination ratio, remember, I have my model, and I have a slide later where I have those two columns, remember? So I just traced it back, since I've been doing this month after month. I have the data for 6 months ago, and I eyeballed, and I said, okay, eyeballing this, I take some portion out, and what I get is a reduction, thanks to Omicron, normalized for those differences, of 30 to 40% in the IFR. So it's not quite the 50% that I had in my thought experiment, but it is significant. And so that has encouraged me to reduce my IFR, but I'm not going down to 0.18, I'm just going down to 0.19 to be a little conservative, but that still has, of course, an impact on infection ratio, and the infection ratio now has jumped to 81%. So Omicron does drive high infections, even though accelerated infections, because it's more transmissible, even though I pointed out last time that in many countries now the natural penetration is so high, 60, 70, 80% already, right? That, of course, these additional, these accelerated Omicron infections are very frequently second infections and not first infections. And second infections are not counted here in this graphic. Right? These are first infections. Percentage of people worldwide who've had a first infection. Right? So a lot of these Omicron infections that we are counting right now, the reported cases, they're actually second infections, and therefore they are not driving up my percentage here. Okay, but still 81% penetration now. And in terms of fatalities, if the IFR is lower, it also means the expected total fatality will be lower, right? To 12.3 million now. The previous number was 12.75, I think. The calculated actual fatalities are a bit below 10 million now. And the overall excess mortality is also a bit lower, right? So all these numbers a bit lower because of the lower IFR. Yeah, meanwhile, the reported fatalities keep going up. So the ratio between my calculated fatalities and the reported fatalities has shrunk further, largely because of this reduction in IFR. But this is a one-off. So next month, we will see fatalities rising again. And also, of course, the infection ratio will also continue rising. But the infection ratio the curve will be rather flat going forward, is my prediction. Right? Unless there's fresh data that shows Omicron's IFR is even lower than the 30–40% reduction that I calculated or eyeballed. If it was 50%, if some new data comes about that is normalized and it shows it's 50%, then I might reduce my IFR to 0.18%, but I want to be cautious on this because if anything, my IFR, compared to when occasionally data pops up, as I said in South Africa 2 months ago, there was some data, I tend to be slightly aggressive on my IFR, so I don't want to be too aggressive now thanks to Omicron. Omicron definitely lowers the fatality. There is no doubt, as I said, at least by 30–40%. That may be conservative, maybe even better. But most people who get Omicron already were infected before. So therefore, anyways, we're not at a significant risk of a second infection, whether it's Omicron or Delta. So therefore, that impact is buffered by the fact that many people have already encountered another variant of the virus before and have some natural immunity. Plus, on top of that, of course, the vaccinations. Right? So the impact, Omicron may be significantly less fatal, but the impact of that isn't that big because we are already largely through, basically, in many countries. Mapping the progression. Sweden is a model, right? So the green curve is modeled on Sweden. Sweden was sort of a model country until like late sort of December or January 2021, when the government did start make a bit of a U-turn and impose some more restrictions. Initially, they had very few restrictions, and therefore they were my model state. Anyways, the curve is modeled on Sweden, and you can see Sweden largely follows the curve. Obviously, Northern Hemisphere seasonal cycles. Obviously, in the Southern Hemisphere, they would be different, 6 months delayed, those cycles. And of course, in many tropical countries and so on, you wouldn't have that strong seasonality at all. So their distribution would be different. But for Northern Hemisphere countries, this curve is sort of a good approximation, I think, as to what you would expect. So I have, Germany broadly follows this, slightly lower than Sweden in terms of the penetration. US broadly follows this, but across the board higher than Sweden, meaning there's just been more infections, more fatalities per capita, significantly more, almost like double. 2 reasons. One, quite liberal and people not caring too much and, just letting it be. But second, also higher local national IFR, because generally less healthy population, especially in terms of obesity and diabetes and so on. Also, the healthcare system being ranked in my rankings lower than that in Sweden or Germany. And so these things, in my model, I have calculated the expected IFR per those 20 or so countries that I have in my model, and the US is one of the highest. And that's, even though they don't have the most aged population, they have the unhealthiest population in the entire sample. And so that drives fatalities, right? So they're expected to be higher than in Sweden, and they are. But partially it's also because people are just more liberal and take care, less precautions, and the Swedes being quite conservative and principled and careful. UK, Yeah, it's a bit like the US, but it's more spiky. So the policy's been very erratic, but lately, as I said, since July 2021, I'm quite a fan. In fact, I was already a fan in January 2021 because the UK was really the first country to kick in with the massive vaccinations. And yes, they vaccinated a lot of people who don't need it, but they did also vaccinate quite a lot of people who do need it. So they had a really, I mean, they were quick out of the starting block when it came to vaccination, and they were quick out of the starting block when it came to giving people most of their rights back. And they did that as early as last summer, which is a very good timing because in summer, anyways, the thing is slow, right? So they did the right for the last 15 months. The UK has done largely the right things, right? For the first 9 months, they were very erratic. Yeah. Anyways, that's what you get, that curve. Okay, the usual thing here. So Sweden is quite far away from reaching herd immunity. That's because, for some reason, vaccinations have gone down to a trickle. So the vaccination rate is very slow now, and that's the main reason why Sweden seems to be many months away from reaching 90% herd immunity. But that can change again if next month the vaccination figures are a bit higher again. But because the calculated natural immunization is still relatively low, less than 50% in Sweden, yeah, that's what you have. Maybe the Swedes have been overcautious and they should just let go now and play. Yeah, that would be my recommendation to them. They were so disciplined that maybe that they went too far. They should just go and get the natural immunization done now. But by and large, you get what you would expect. The back to normal countries, by and large, are there. The muddled through countries, some are there, but many are not. And the new normal countries are still, to some degree, quite far away from reaching herd immunity, as you would expect. Now, South Korea is interesting. They're only 5 months away compared to 23 months in Japan. But that's just because the vaccination rate recently has been very high. But that may soon flatten, and then the South Korea number of months will be getting bigger again. The same Philippines. Philippines, I actually don't have vaccination numbers because they are not reported. So I just plug in some imagined number, and I think I plugged in quite a big jump. And that's why all of a sudden Philippines seems to be 1 month away from having herd immunity, but I'm not sure that's true. Right? Also on their natural infection ratio, I'm not sure because it's a bit iffy. My assumptions around the multiplier for excess mortality also a bit iffy. So the Philippines there's just really not very good data, basically. I don't remember why I included them in my model. I had a reason why I included them in my model. Normally, I'm only covering countries where I have some pretty decent data, right? But yeah, somehow the Philippines I added later. Because I remember I got in December 2020, I got some excess mortality figures for the Philippines, so I included them. But it's a bit iffy, but doesn't matter. Just one thing, the US published a nationwide seroprevalence study. Remember early on, I recommended governments should do regular seroprevalence studies because that would give you a really true picture of immunization levels. Most governments didn't. Remember, several Indian provinces did for a few months, but then they dropped it again. Sweden did a few times and they dropped it again. So apparently it's expensive. It's, they didn't see the value. I would have thought they would continuously do it because then instead of my having to craft this curve that I'm showing you in terms of infection ratio, if countries had just done enough seroprevalence studies, we would have real data and wouldn't need to just calculate it like I do. Now, I trust into my calculation. I think it's probably not that far off, but it would have been much preferable if you had regular seroprevalence studies. The US has just published one, but they also didn't do it really regularly. So the problem is, since the antibodies disappear after a while, if you have gaps, if you don't do this very regularly, then the data is not that meaningful because you will miss some people who were infected, but it doesn't show anymore because you waited too long to measure. So this 43% that they measured is not inconsistent with my 67%. they say at a minimum 43, and then they in the text also talk about how, you know, certain groups are not captured and right? So the 43 is the absolute, those which actually can be measured now on a statistically significant level across the nation, but they know they missed some, right? And I'm saying, you know, you missed quite a lot. You basically, you know, it's 67% rather than 43 in my model, right? And I still stick by my model there. I don't think it's very far off, right? But still, I wanted to report this. So since I always report any kind of interesting new data that I find. So even if you do a snapshot seroprevalence now, and missing some people who were like early births, for example, and no longer show any antibodies that are detectable, you get a 43% penetration in the US. So actually, I think my 67% is not bad there. Yeah, not bad. It's probably about there. Yeah, nothing new here. So I talked about this at length last time, so I don't need to go again. Vaccinations, yeah. So vaccination activity has declined a bit. It's less aggressive now. You hear fewer and fewer voices of people pushing for more boosters and more boosters, and third world countries being inundated with vaccines. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that I raised like 2 years ago, that many of the poorer countries, yes, they will have difficulty putting their hands on vaccines. And yes, they need some vaccine for sure, because they do have some elderly and other vulnerables, but they need far less of the stuff than the rich countries who have much more aged societies generally, right? So I think you're hearing now less and less voices pushing for, you know, vaccinate, right? So that's good. I think people are starting to say, okay, we have reached quite a high vaccination level in many countries, and secondly, yeah, maybe the vaccination isn't the, you know, the panacea that some people thought it was, right? And some people even, I saw one person from one health ministry, I think it was Iceland actually, that you know, saying actually out loud what I've been saying for 2 years, which is, you can't just rely on vaccines or such measures. You need to rely on natural immunization. Only natural immunization will give you the, in the long run, the actual kind of safety that your immune system can afford you, right? And I think people, it's only Iceland with 200,000, 200 or 300,000 people, so it's a very small country, but at least some officials are starting to make sense when they talk publicly. I mean, that's new, right? It hasn't happened in the previous 2 years that anybody really made sense, with the exception of like Trump saying, don't let the virus dominate your life. That made sense. But there were, and the Swedish Prime Minister probably said a few things that made sense, but by and large, people made no sense at all. And I think they are starting to make a little bit of sense. So with two years delay, they're starting to, I think, understand a little bit how this virus works. So some health ministry official from Iceland, I think, said basically in the long run, what we need is natural immunization. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Right? It's 2 years too late, but okay, better late than never. So I think if that view starts sort of penetrating, then, and with the Ukraine crisis or Ukraine invasion taking, you know, people's eyes off the COVID ball and giving them a new toy, I think with luck, this whole vaccination mania is sort of going to ebb away. Yeah. Also, Omicron helps, right? Apparently, in the mind of people, Omicron is so much less dangerous. Actually, as I say, it's maybe 30 to 40% less than Delta. It's significant, but it's not that much less. But it's all in the mind, right? People thought Delta was super dangerous, and now they think Omicron is much less dangerous. Actually, the difference isn't that big. But I think the Omicron having overwhelmed in terms of the case numbers, and people don't realize that many of those cases are second infections, so they don't really matter that much anymore. The first infection is the key one, right? Whereas the Delta infection, almost all of them, the vast majority of them were first infections. So, right, people in their minds compare apples and oranges, and the oranges now, they look beautiful, and the apples last year looked so terrible. But good, I mean, the perception is shifting, right? It's not shifting based on real understanding. But for the most part, most people still don't understand what's going on, and they don't know why their perception is changing, but their perception is changing. Right? And as I said at the very beginning, the invasion of Ukraine may help in that people have a new thing to worry about. Right? And people apparently have a need to worry about something. That seems to be a fundamental human need. And for the last 2 years, there was nothing else to worry about but COVID. So it was COVID, 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 COVID. And now finally, yeah, thanks to the sacrifice of our Ukrainian fellow humans, humanity now has something new to worry about. And all of a sudden, this whole COVID and vaccination, you know, maybe with some luck, it's gonna go away, right? With the caveat that I made earlier, that these three types of discrimination, they may linger on in many places for a long time to come. I fear that they will. Right? So we're not going back to completely normal, but I think we are going back to somewhat more normal kind of circumstances, and partially thanks to Omicron, partially thanks to the vaccines, partially thanks to some people are starting to think or starting to understand what this is actually about, and partially because of the Ukraine invasion. So thanks to Mr. Putin, and with apologies to our Ukrainian fellows, I know they are suffering. Yeah, so long-term scenarios, yeah, I said before, we are talking decades here, so it's no point every month to talk about this too much. I think there will be a split. I think the old folks are basically all zombies now, and they kind of, you know, their whole life consists of health issues and how do I stay alive, rather than how do I have a good life, you know, how do I live? So Walking Dead. And the young people escape from this landscape that is populated by Walking Dead. In many Western countries, more and more of the people are these Walking Dead. But the young ones escape, and their escape route is into the metaverse, where they will be more and more disembodied, more and more live a digital lifestyle, and be more and more separate from the aging Walking Dead. And I don't think we've ever in the history of mankind had such a big diversion of the young and the old population, but that's what I fear. I don't think it's healthy, but I think that's what's in the cards over the next few decades. But yeah, we are talking years, if not decades, so we will see. With that, this was a relatively quick one. Thank you, and see you in a month's time. Take care. Bye-bye.